There is a question Machiavelli asked that has unsettled men for 5 centuries. He asked it plainly, without apology, in the middle of a book that was already making powerful people deeply uncomfortable. The question was this: is it better to be loved or to be feared? And then, before you had time to formulate your comfortable answer, he gave you his. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. That line has been quoted endlessly, misunderstood almost as endlessly, and used to justify everything from petty workplace dominance to genuine cruelty by men who read the surface and missed the depth entirely. Because what Machiavelli was actually describing was not a formula for becoming someone people are afraid of. He was describing something far more sophisticated and far more demanding, a formula for becoming someone people cannot afford to dismiss. Most men never reckon with this question honestly, because the honest reckoning is uncomfortable. It requires you to look at what you actually produce in the people around you, not what you hope you produce or what you tell yourself you produce, but what actually happens in the room when you make a commitment, set a standard, or draw a line. Do people take it seriously? Do they factor it into their behavior? Do they think twice before they test it? Or have you, through a long series of compromises, extensions, and quiet backdowns, trained the people in your life to understand that your standards are negotiable, your boundaries are suggestions, and your limits are starting points for a conversation rather than actual limits? That training happens slowly. It happens in the small moments no one announces. It happens every time you let something slide that you said mattered. Every time you accept an outcome you said was unacceptable. Every time you signal, through action or inaction, that your word does not quite mean what it sounded like it meant. And the result of that training is not that people love you more for your flexibility. The result is that they respect you less, often without quite being able to name why. Often while genuinely liking you as a person, they simply stop taking you seriously as a man who means what he says. And that loss of seriousness is one of the most corrosive things that can happen to a man's sense of himself and his actual effectiveness in the world. This video is about what Machiavelli was actually pointing at with his brutal question, not how to make people afraid of you. How to build the kind of presence that makes people understand you are not a man to be taken lightly. Those are different things, entirely different things. And the man who knows the difference, who has built one and refuses the other, is the man who has genuinely cracked Machiavelli's formula. If that distinction matters to you, you are in the right place. And if this kind of philosophically grounded, unflinchingly honest examination of what it means to be a serious man is what you come here for, subscribe, because it is all this channel exists to build. The question behind the question. Before we can understand what Machiavelli meant, we have to understand what he was observing. He was not writing from ideology. He was writing from meticulous observation of men in power, what worked, what failed, and what patterns repeated themselves across different rulers, different contexts, different centuries of recorded history. And one pattern he observed with striking consistency was this: the ruler who governed primarily through being loved was always eventually at the mercy of the conditions that sustained that love. When those conditions changed, when he needed to make a decision that disappointed people, when circumstances demanded something unpopular, the love evaporated, and with it, all the compliance it had been generating. He was left with nothing structural, nothing that held regardless of how people felt about him in any given moment. The ruler who governed through genuine respect, on the other hand, had built something more durable. Not love, which is conditional and emotional and subject to the weather of circumstance, something closer to a settled understanding in the minds of the people around him, that this man means what he says, follows through on what he commits to, and maintains his standard, regardless of whether the particular moment makes that convenient or uncomfortable. That understanding, Machiavelli observed, persists. It doesn't dissolve when you make a hard decision. It doesn't evaporate when people are disappointed, because it was never based on how people felt. It was based on what they had repeatedly observed to be true. Here is what most men miss when they read that passage. Machiavelli was not saying that love is bad, or that affection is a weakness, or that a man should cultivate coldness as a strategy. He was identifying a structural vulnerability in the man who has allowed being liked to become more important than being consistent, who has traded his standard piece by piece in exchange for approval, who has made himself comfortable to be around by making himself easy to ignore. That man is not loved, not really. He is tolerated with warmth, and there is a profound and painful difference between those two things, a difference that becomes most visible when something genuinely important is at stake. Fear is the wrong word. The translation problem at the center of this entire conversation is that the word fear, as Machiavelli used it, does not map cleanly onto the English word we reach for when we read it. What he was describing was closer to what we might call weight, the quality of a man whose commitments carry actual mass, whose presence in a negotiation, a relationship, or a conflict means something concrete, whose yes is reliable because his no has been demonstrated to be real. The Latin tradition Machiavelli was drawing from understood this distinction. The fear of a serious man was not the fear of arbitrary violence or unpredictable cruelty. It was the fear of consequence. The understanding that this man's standards are not decorative. Think about the men you have known in your life, or know now, who carry this quality. Not the men who raise their voices or make threats. Not the men who perform dominance with aggression and bluster. The men who speak quietly and mean everything they say. The men whose disappointment feels like something, whose withdrawal of approval has actual weight, whose rare expression of anger makes a room pay attention, not because anyone is afraid of being physically hurt, but because everyone present understands that this man does not perform emotion. When he signals that something has crossed a line, it has crossed a line. When he says he is done with something, he is done. That quality is not manufactured. It cannot be faked or performed into existence. It is built slowly, you through an unbroken history of meaning what you say and doing what you said you would do. Epictetus, who had been stripped of every external form of power imaginable, radiated exactly this quality. His students described sitting with him as an experience of genuine weight. Not fear in the sense of anxiety, but awareness, the sense that in his presence, ordinary pretenses did not quite hold up, that the space for comfortable self-deception was somehow reduced. That is the version of Machiavelli's feared man worth building toward, the man who makes the truth more visible simply by being present because he himself is not operating at a distance from it. The architecture of standards, here is the mechanism Machiavelli was actually describing, translated into the life of a man who is not governing a principality, but navigating a career, relationships, a family, a community of other men. Your standards are the architecture of how people relate to you, not your stated standards, not the values you describe when someone asks you to describe yourself. Your demonstrated standards, the ones you have shown through your behavior under pressure and inconvenience and social cost, that you will actually hold when holding them costs you something real. Those are the standards that matter. Those are the ones that shape how people treat you. When your standards are high and genuinely held, several things happen simultaneously. People make different decisions in advance rather than after the fact. They factor your actual expectations into what they offer you, commit to you, bring to their dealings with you. They do not test limits they understand to be real. They do not make promises they have no intention of keeping, because they understand that doing so will have a consequence they do not want to deal with. This is not a social dynamic built on fear in any toxic sense. It is a social dynamic built on clarity. Everyone around you knows what you will and will not accept, and they plan accordingly. When your standards are low or high in statement and low in enforcement, the opposite happens. People optimize for the minimum that will satisfy you because they understand that your stated expectations are aspirational rather than actual. They push timelines because they have learned you will accommodate the push. They make commitments loosely because they have observed that loose commitments are what you actually require, regardless of what you say you require. They treat your disappointment as something to be managed emotionally rather than something to be prevented structurally, because your disappointment has no consistent consequence attached to it. Marcus Aurelius understood the cost of the second dynamic at a scale most of us will never encounter. An emperor who cannot enforce his standards, who can be flattered or pressured into tolerating what he has said is intolerable, does not create a more harmonious empire. He creates one in which every court official, every general, every provincial governor understands that the emperor's word is a starting position for negotiation rather than a settled reality. The resulting instability is not benevolent. It is the specific kind of chaos that only develops in the absence of genuine authority. And genuine authority, at every scale, is always built the same way, through the consistent demonstration that you mean what you say and will maintain your standard regardless of the social cost of doing so. The trap of being, like Machiavelli's deepest insight on this question, is not really about fear at all. It is about what happens to a man who has allowed the need to be liked to become his primary navigational instrument, who makes his decisions not from his own values and judgment, but from a constant background calculation about what will maintain other people's approval of him. That man is not free. He is governed more completely than any external authority could govern him by the imagined opinions of the people around him. And the irony is total. His desperate investment in being liked is precisely what makes him difficult to genuinely respect. You have probably felt this dynamic without having named it. The manager who is so invested in his team liking him that he cannot have a difficult performance conversation without it becoming an apology. The friend who agrees with everyone and therefore provides no real orientation. The partner who accommodates every preference but never expresses his own, so that being with him is easy in the moment and somehow deeply unsatisfying over time, because you are never quite encountering a real person, just a surface shaped to reflect what you want to see. These men are often genuinely liked in the way that comfortable furniture is liked. You are glad it is there. You do not particularly think about it. You do not respect it. The need to be liked is, at its root, a form of fear. The fear of disapproval, the fear of conflict, the fear that your actual self, expressed honestly and maintained consistently, will be found unacceptable by the people whose acceptance you have made central to your sense of your own worth. That fear does not produce warmth. It produces performance, and performance sustained long enough produces exactly the isolation it was designed to prevent, because no one can genuinely connect with a performance. They can enjoy it, be comfortable around it, find it pleasant, but they cannot respect it, cannot rely on it, cannot bring their full honest self to an encounter with it, because they understand at some level, even if they never articulate it, that the performance will adjust itself to reflect back whatever they bring rather than offering them something real to engage with. Seneca wrote about this with considerable force. He observed that the man who shapes himself to please everyone has no shape at all, that the desire for universal approval is the surest path to becoming universally forgettable. Not because people do not enjoy the company of a man who makes them comfortable, but because enjoyment and respect are not the same thing, and the man who chases the first at the expense of the second has misunderstood what actually matters in the building of a life worth living. What real respect actually requires. Here is the part most discussions of this topic avoid because it is the genuinely demanding part. Respect, the kind Machiavelli was describing, the kind that persists when conditions change and when the people around you are disappointed, and when maintaining your standard costs you something real is not produced by aggression or coldness or the performance of dominance. It is produced by something far more difficult. It is produced by the willingness to hold a standard when holding it is uncomfortable, when the person in front of you is someone whose approval you value, when the social cost of maintaining your position is real and immediate, when the easy path is to make an exception just this once and the hard path is to be the same man you said you were going to be. That willingness, practiced consistently over time, is what builds the quality Machiavelli was pointing at. Every time you follow through when following through is hard, you are adding to a structural foundation. Every time you maintain your standard when the room expects you to negotiate it away, you are demonstrating something about the nature of your commitments that cannot be demonstrated any other way. Every time you say no from a grounded place without aggression, without lengthy justification, without apologizing for the disappointment, you are showing the people around you something important about who you actually are rather than who you aspire to be. Aristotle called this the virtue of justice in its deepest sense, giving to each situation and each person what it and they actually deserve, not what makes the moment comfortable. And the man who practices this consistently develops what Aristotle called practical wisdom, the ability to see clearly what a situation actually requires and to respond to that reality rather than to the social pressure surrounding it. That kind of clarity is not cold, it is not unkind, but it is absolutely uncompromisingly honest. And that honesty, expressed consistently through behavior rather than declaration, is the foundation of every form of genuine respect worth having. The dangerous middle ground Machiavelli was particularly concerned with what he called the man who tries to avoid being hated without being willing to fully earn being respected, the man who occupies the middle ground between real standards and real accommodation, who is neither genuinely respected nor genuinely liked, but exists in a permanent state of managed perception, working constantly to keep everyone mildly satisfied, while never quite being honest enough with anyone to produce anything real. This is the most common failure mode among men who are intelligent enough to understand that pure aggression doesn't work, but have not yet built the courage for genuine consistency. You probably recognize the behavior, the commitment made with just enough ambiguity that when it isn't kept, the interpretation is contested. The boundary stated once and then quietly abandoned when maintaining it created friction. The standard that seems firm until the specific person whose approval matters most applies pressure, at which point the standard develops an exception that somehow becomes the new rule. The man living in this middle ground is permanently exhausted because the performance of consistency while actually being inconsistent requires constant management. He is always tracking what he has said to whom, always calibrating how much he can ask for in any given situation, always gauging whether this particular moment is one where his standard will be taken seriously or where he will need to back down gracefully and pretend it was his choice. That exhaustion is not incidental. It is the cost of the gap between the man he presents and the man he actually is, and closing that gap, which is the only thing that actually eliminates the exhaustion, requires something that most men experience as frightening before they experience it as liberating. The willingness to be honestly and completely who you are without the management, without the calibration, without the constant performance. To set a standard because you genuinely hold it and not because it makes you look like someone who holds high standards. To follow through not because someone is watching, but because your word to yourself is the most important commitment you make. This is where the Stoic tradition provides what Machiavelli alone cannot. Machiavelli tells you that the middle ground is dangerous and ineffective. The Stoics tell you what to replace it with, and what to replace it with is not a strategy but a character. A man who has developed genuine integrity in the literal sense of the word, integrated, whole, the same in every room, does not need to manage perceptions or calibrate presentations. He is simply himself, consistently and completely. And other people's assessment of that consistency is their business and not his primary concern. The line between respect and fear. We must make the distinction that Machiavelli himself made, though less explicitly than the tradition has sometimes acknowledged, between the kind of fear that produces respect and the kind that produces only resentment and the desire for revenge at the first available opportunity. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must avoid being hated, and this instruction does more work in his framework than is usually recognized, because the men who read the feared over love passage and conclude that cruelty is the lesson have missed the boundary he drew around it. Cruelty produces fear of a different and entirely useless kind. It produces the fear of the unpredictable, the arbitrary. The man whose anger bears no reliable relationship to any action you have taken and therefore cannot be navigated or managed. That kind of fear generates hatred, and hatred generates the permanent coalition of people who are waiting for your position to weaken so they can act on it. Machiavelli watched this dynamic destroy rulers repeatedly. The man who maintained his power through terror rather than through genuine respect was always one moment of visible weakness away from total collapse, because the resentment that had been building under the surface of enforced compliance had nowhere to go except outward the moment the enforcement slipped. The respect Machiavelli was actually prescribing is built on consistency and on justice, on the understanding that this man's standards are predictable, that he applies them without favoritism, that the consequences he has established for crossing his lines will actually materialize, and that those consequences are proportionate to what they are responding to. That is a fundamentally different relationship than the one built on arbitrary power. It is closer to what we mean when we talk about a father who is respected by his children, not because they are afraid he will harm them unpredictably, but because they understand that he means what he says, that his values are real rather than performed, and that there is something in him that is larger and more settled than the immediate social comfort of any given moment. That presence, solid, consistent, just, and unmovable on the things that matter, is what the tradition has always called authority, not dominance, authority. And it is built the same way in every context and at every scale. Building the presence. So what does this actually look like in the daily life of a man who is working to develop this quality? It looks like the small, unglamorous, consistently chosen moments that add up to something the world eventually has to recognize. It looks like the conversation you have, calmly and directly, about something that has crossed a line when every social signal in the room is telling you to let it go. It looks like the commitment you keep to yourself when no one is watching and nothing external is enforcing it. It looks like the no you give without a lengthy explanation, because you understand that your decisions do not require the approval of the person you are declining. It looks like the standard you maintain with the specific person whose reaction you most want to avoid, because you understand that making exceptions for the people whose approval you most value is precisely how standards stop being standards and start being suggestions. Over time, this accumulation of small, consistent choices produces something that does not announce itself, but becomes unmistakable. People begin to factor you in differently. They bring different things to their interactions with you. They offer more, deliver more, commit more carefully, because they have learned, not from anything you said, but from everything you did, that you actually mean what you say and that the standards you hold are real. That shift in how people relate to you is not dramatic. It does not happen in a single confrontation or a single demonstration of resolve. It happens in the long accumulation of moments in which you were the same man when it was easy and when it was hard, when the room was watching and when no one was, when maintaining your standard cost you something and when it cost you nothing. Epictetus called this the practice of living in accordance with what you actually value rather than what you say you value. He made the distinction brutally clear. Your real values are not the ones you articulate. They are the ones revealed by your behavior under pressure. When pressure comes, what do you protect? What do you sacrifice? What do you bend for? The answers to those questions, accumulated across thousands of small decisions, are the actual architecture of your character. And that architecture, read by the people around you, is what determines whether they take you seriously. The cost no one mentions. There is a cost to building this kind of presence that most discussions of the topic do not mention honestly, and it is a cost worth naming directly. Some people will not like it. Some people who are currently comfortable in their relationship with you because your standards have been manageable will become uncomfortable when you stop managing them. Some relationships that have been built on the quiet understanding that you will accommodate will need to be renegotiated, and some of them will not survive that renegotiation. Some of those people will leave. Some of them will become hostile, and you will feel the pull, sometimes strongly, to make the exception, to go back to the version of yourself that was easier to be around, because that version did not produce this kind of friction. Machiavelli was clear about this cost too. He did not pretend it was painless or that the transition from accommodating to genuinely principled was socially smooth. He observed that the ruler who raises his standards after a period of lower standards always faces a more difficult adjustment than the ruler who began from a position of clarity, because the people around him have been trained to expect something he is no longer providing, and the withdrawal of that accommodation feels like a change for the worse, even when it is a change toward something better. The discomfort is real, the friction is real, the losses are sometimes real. But here is what is also real: the relationships that survive, and the new ones that develop in the space created by the old ones leaving, are relationships between your actual self and people who can genuinely engage with your actual self. That exchange, comfort for authenticity, easy accommodation for real respect, is one of the most important and most frightening trades a man can make. And almost every man who has made it reports the same thing afterward, that what he gained was not just respect from others, but something more fundamental, a respect for himself that had been slowly eroded by the long practice of being whatever the room needed him to be, and was slowly rebuilt by the practice of being the same man regardless of what the room needed. Where Machiavelli was wrong, this channel holds Machiavelli honestly, and holding him honestly means acknowledging where the Stoic tradition parts ways with him, because that parting is significant and worth understanding. Machiavelli was ultimately a consequentialist. He assessed the value of any approach, including the cultivation of respect over love, by its effectiveness in producing desired outcomes. For him, the question was always, does this work? Does this produce the power, the stability, the results the ruler is seeking? And if it does, it is justified by those results. The Stoics refused this frame entirely. For Marcus Aurelius, for Epictetus, for Seneca, the question was never primarily whether a course of action worked. It was whether a course of action was right, whether it aligned with virtue, whether it was something a man of genuine character could stand behind, not because of what it produced, but because of what it expressed about who he actually was. And on this point, the Stoic tradition offers a corrective to Machiavelli that is not optional if you are genuinely serious about the kind of man you are building. The version of Machiavellian respect worth pursuing is not the version that cultivates the appearance of high standards as a strategy for generating compliance. It is the version built by actually holding high standards because they reflect who you genuinely are and what you genuinely value. Not because holding them works, though it does, because holding them is right, because the man who maintains his standard when maintaining it costs him something is demonstrating not strategic sophistication but genuine integrity. And genuine integrity does not calculate its returns before deciding whether to show up. It shows up because that is what genuine integrity does. The respect that results from that showing up is real and durable in a way that strategically produced respect never quite manages to be, because it is grounded in something that has no gap between the surface and what is underneath.